מה מבדיל את העניים מהעשירים? עכשיו, בעבר התשובה הזאת הייתה פשוטה. לעשירים יש מזון אחר, בגדים אחרים, אמצעי תחבורה אחרים, ואפילו רופאים אחרים. אבל בעידן שלנו, שאנשים כמו ביל גייטס ווורן באפט לבושים בגדול כמוני וכמוך, ולכולם יש אייפון 16 בכיס, אז איך באמת העשירים יגדירו שהם עשירים והם שונים מאיתנו? לפי האורח שלי היום, מה שמפריד בין העשירים ובין העניים זה האמונות שלהם. בדיוק כמו פעם לגבי ביגוד, יש אמונות שהן יותר מדי יקרות בשביל אדם נורמלי להחזיק, ולאמונות האלה קוראים luxury beliefs. עכשיו, הרעיון הזה הוא רעיון מעניין, כי האורח שלי היום, למרות שיש לו דוקטורט בפסיכולוגיה מקמברידג', גדל בסלאמס של הסלאמס, עם משפחות אומנה ומאמצות וסמים ומכות וכל מה שאתם רוצים, ובסוף הוא באמת הגיע מאוד 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 גבוה, אבל הדבר המעניין שהוא ראה את איך שהדברים נראים במציאות. כמו דיקנס בספר שלו בין שתי ערים, שיש את לונדון של העשירים ולונדון של העניים, ככה. ואחד הדברים, או אחת האמונות זה, יאללה, לא צריך משפחה נורמלית, או לא צריך אבא ואמא. ופתאום הוא הבין עד כמה לחיות בלי אבא, זה דבר שהוא מאוד מאוד בעייתי, וזה אגב אחת מהאמונות שהעשירים מחזיקים בהם. אז זאת הייתה שיחה מרתקת על המשמעות של האמונות האלה בחיים שלנו, ואיך אפשר להיפטר מהם, ולמה באמת מחזיקים באמונות שהן כל כך נוראיות. שלום לכולם, לי קוראים רועי יוזביץ, ובערוץ הזה אני מביא את האורחים המדהימים ביותר לדבר על נושאים מרתקים גם מארץ וגם מחול. אם הדברים האלה נראים לכם מעניינים, אתם מוזמנים לעשות כמה דברים. א', תירשמו לערוץ. למה? כי לפי האלגוריתם של יוטיוב זה מאוד עוזר להביא את השיחה הזאת לעוד אנשים חכמים כמוכם. אם אתם רוצים לעשות עוד, לכו לפטריון. ובפטריון אתם יכולים לקבל הרבה מאוד דברים מעניינים. בין היתר, עוד מעט אנחנו מתחילים סדרת הרצאות על זוגיות, או שיחות על זוגיות, שתהיה זמינה בפטריון. אז אם זה מעניין אתכם, אתם מוזמנים לעשות את זה גם שם. אתם מוזמנים להזמין הרצאות, ספרים, קורסים. יש לי קורס גם על בינה מלאכותית וגם על הצלחה בלימודים. ועכשיו, רוב הנדרסון. השיחה באנגלית, אבל יש כתוביות. בהצלחה. In ancient times, the difference between the rich and the poor was very clear. Different clothing, different health system, different transport, different food. But nowadays, when billionaires like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates having the same clothes that you and I are having, and we are all having iPhone 16, what separates the poor from the rich? And just like in all time, some beliefs are solely for the rich, for the exact same reason that was ever before. What I mean is, some beliefs are too expensive for the normal people to hold. And the person who introduced the idea of luxury belief is my guest today. His name is Rob Henderson, and he is the author of a great book named Troubled, a memorial. Just a second, I have it over here. A memoir of foster care, family, and social class, which is a very emotional, but also very, very hard book to read emotionally, but it has many great wisdom. Rob Henderson, thank you so much for coming. How are you today?
I'm good. Good, Roy. How are you?
Very, very good. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to this conversation and the idea of luxury belief, but I think that the theory in your book is so correlated with your biography. And when I read your biography, two things came to mind. One is a biography by Larry Elder, and the other is Charles Dickens, Between Two Cities, where we don't know and we don't want to know what is lower class London looks like. And I think that your biography basically like put a mirror, a very harsh mirror to what is not in the elite university. So with your permission, I think that we can start with your with your name, Robert Kim Henderson, but could you please like in 5 minutes tell like the gist of your family story, which is crucial to understanding your theory?
Yeah, sure. Well, I have a PhD in psychology from the University of Cambridge, studied at Yale before that. And, before entering these universities, my life was a lot different, though. I Was born into poverty in Los Angeles, grew up in foster homes all around California, had this winding indirect path to higher education with some, missteps and mistakes along the way, which I read about in Troubled. But, in the preface of Troubled, I introduced the reader to the story they're about to go through using my name. So my full name is Robert Kim Henderson. My first name, Robert, comes from my biological father, who I never met. The only information I had about him up until recently was his name from some documents from social workers responsible for my case when I was in the foster care system. My middle name, Kim, comes from my mother. It was her family name. She came to the U.S. She moved to California from Seoul, from South Korea as a young woman. She originally was intended to study, but then she started to do drugs and hang out with different kinds of people who didn't have her best intentions in mind. Eventually, she gave birth to me. We were homeless for a time. We lived in a car. Eventually, we settled in this slum apartment in Westlake, which was this rundown neighborhood in Los Angeles. I was 3 years old by this point, and some police officers arrived, some social workers. They saw the kind of squalor that I was living in and asked my mother where my father was. She said she didn't know. She was not in a position to care for me. And so I was placed into the LA County foster care system at age 3 and spent the next 5 years living in 7 different foster homes. And I describe in Troubled the kind of emotional challenge this put on me as a little kid, constantly moving to different homes, different schools, different foster siblings, different caretakers, just that kind of extreme instability and uncertainty, and the effect that had on me as a kid. And, eventually I was adopted just shy of my 8th birthday by this couple, this married couple, a man and a woman and their daughter, who became my adoptive sister. We settled in this working class town in Northern California, a very blue collar town. Most of the people in this town didn't have college degrees. My adoptive father was a truck driver. My adoptive mom was an assistant social worker. And at this time in the late 90s, I kind of got this front row seat. I was a little kid, so I didn't fully understand this, but in hindsight, I understand now that I got this front row seat into the ongoing fragmentation and deterioration of families and neighborhoods in these kind of poor, working class, lower middle class communities all across the U.S., all across, the broader sort of Western world, I think. And
just a second.
So this was difficult for me. Yeah.
Just a second. Is this a fragmentation that Charles Murray speaks about in his book, like Dividing America, that you can see that the intelligent class become more intelligent and got and the distance between the upper level class and the lower level class just increases and increases to a way that it is impossible to negotiate. It's impossible to build a bridge to connect those two.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, I read Coming Apart. I read Charles Murray's work later on when I was in college, and he's done as much or more than any other social scientist to help me, and I think so many other people, understand how these divisions along class lines have been increasing over time. And so I witnessed this firsthand. So, Murray points out that among upper and upper middle class families, the vast majority of children are raised by 2 married parents, whereas in working class families, it's very rare to see it. So if you go back to 1960, regardless of social class, children born into rich families and poor families in the U.S., 95% of children were raised by both of their birth parents. If you fast forward to 2005, for upper and upper middle class families in the U.S., it dropped slightly from 95% in 1960 to 85% in 2005. So a slight decrease, but still the vast majority of kids from affluent families are raised by married parents. But for poor families, in 1960, it was 95% raised by 2 married parents. Fast forward to 2005, and it dropped to 30%. And so that is the situation now in these families, in these communities. And so where I grew up, that was how I had 5 close friends growing up. None of them were raised by both of their birth parents. That was my situation. And when I read that statistic as an adult, 30% seemed actually quite high to me.
And I want to mention another thing because Charles Murray is usually correlated with the bell curve and black versus
Mm,
white. What Charles Murray wanted to do in Coming Apart is to ignore the race thing at all. Therefore, Coming Apart is all about white people. So there is
mm,
nothing about black versus white. We will come to the idea of black families, of fatherless black families, as Obama mentioned, is being the number one problem for black families in the US. But it is very important to mention and to understand and to remember that Coming Apart is just about white families. Okay?
yeah, exactly. No, no, that's a good point. And that, that is something that comes through in Coming Apart, that it's he concentrates on white families only, and it's really about class more than anything else. And you can see this with it's interesting. So recently I had this conversation with someone who is in contact with the Trump administration, and he's concerned with fatherlessness in homes. And he thought, okay, well, perhaps President Trump could give a speech on Father's Day, or someone in his administration could talk about the problem of fatherlessness. And the Trump administration got back to this person and said, oh, actually, we're not going to be able to do this. The reasoning here is because even Trump's base, a lot of people think of Trump's base, working class people, white working class people. Well, in those communities, fatherlessness is a huge problem now too, and they don't want to feel like they're being called out. They don't want to feel, basically, Trump doesn't want to alienate his base or upset the people who voted for him. And so you're right. Yeah, for a long time, people concentrated on fatherlessness in the black community, but the issue is now it's pervasive everywhere. You look at white working class families, Hispanic working class families, fatherlessness outside of that sort of elite bubble of, say, the top 20%, the top 30% of society, regardless of race. If you have a college degree and a six-figure income, in all likelihood, you and the people around you are either married with kids, or that is the path they're about to follow. Whereas for everyone outside of that space, people without college degrees, people who don't have comfortable salaries, that is becoming increasingly hard to achieve. And that was, one of many points that I make in my book, is that, yes, poverty is difficult, material scarcity is difficult, but what is interesting is that for me, and this is borne out in the research, it's that instability and uncertainty and squalor, that's actually in some ways even more challenging and more difficult for young kids to overcome. And I point this out in the book that, developmental psychologists, evolutionary psychologists, they've looked at this question of, basically what are the factors that predict success or predict unsuccessful lives. And they've separated out childhood harshness from childhood instability. So childhood harshness is essentially low family income. If your family didn't have money, what are the odds of you becoming incarcerated later in life, the odds of you not graduating from high school or college, teen pregnancy, substance abuse, all of these things that you wouldn't want for your kid. And what researchers find is that there's a very tenuous connection or correlation between low family income and negative future outcomes. Some studies find no correlation whatsoever. It's completely insignificant. But when researchers measure childhood instability, and instability is measured by the number of relocations you had in childhood, how many different adults moved in and out of your home, how, whether your parents were married or divorced, how many different divorces were there, how many different romantic partners did your primary caregiver have when you were growing up, basically how much day-to-day disorder and uncertainty was there in your life. And researchers find a consistent and powerful correlation between instability in childhood and negative outcomes in adulthood. And that is what I saw. And look, like, we were poor by first world developed country standards where I grew up. Like I said, working class town, people didn't have college degrees, but it wasn't as if we were destitute. What more so the issue for us was people making bad decisions, people making foolhardy choices, not a lot of good guidance or role models around us, no values to live by. And so we would, especially, when I write about the teenagers in my life, we were living for the moment, alcohol, drugs, drinking and driving, violence, all kinds of misadventures and self-defeating behaviors that were really fun in the moment. But later on, we would come to regret it. And when I say we, I mean me and my best friends in high school.
Okay, so with your permission, I would like to weigh in and ask a very uncomfortable question. And the question is, why? Now, I can give some alternative answers. Charles Murray in the bell curve say, listen, there is a correlation between low intelligence and the tendency to divorce in the first 5 years. If intelligence measure to some extent how do you get decisions, how good your decisions are, getting divorce is a bad decision. So one can, separate it into intelligence. One can go into the social class or the economy. Single mother are getting more paid from the government. Therefore, there is a motivation. There is a very bad motivation for women to become single mother. And the other thing, which I don't know if you mentioned, I don't remember that I saw you mention, is the idea of lack of values in respect to, not teaching the Bible from the 68 to the 85, the Supreme Court decision. So when we said as a society, as like the American society, that we don't want to teach the Bible, the Ten Commandments in K-12 schools, basically there was a vacuum of values that was never filled with alternative humanism values. So in your perspective, in your opinion, we have the intelligence, we have the social or the economy, and the single mother being paid more, and we have the Christian values. What would you consider the most important factors? The most important factors?
All of those are important. The economic incentives, the vacuum with regard to values, shifting cultural norms over time, lack of examples and role models, all of these things, a sort of abdication of responsibility from, the elite. And, I think that, for me, it's probably the values question. Now, the economic incentive question plays a role here too, but people respond powerfully to rewards, to respect, to admiration, to the judgments of their peers around them. And there was a period starting in the 1960s, it was a fashionable view, which I call a luxury belief, which we can get to later if you like. But the luxury belief was that, family structure doesn't matter. Marriage is outdated, and we don't need to live by these views anymore. These are sort of outdated, patriarchal assumptions that we've been living by, and so we can move beyond them. And many of the elite, they expressed those views, but they didn't actually live by them. And meanwhile, those views became very popular and fashionable among working class and lower middle class, poor people. And gradually over time, that in addition to the economic piece that you described, basically incentivizing people to not get married because you would get paid to avoid marriage, that played an important role too. But I do want to say here, though, that, you mentioned, the heritability of divorce, intelligence, those kinds of things. But again, I just want to highlight, though, that there was a period in American history in the mid-20th century. Up until that point, divorce rates were nearly identical between the rich and the poor, between, you could say, the intelligent and the less intelligent. Single parenthood was nearly identical. If you looked at the lives, I mean, that was one of the points of coming apart. Is if you wind back the clock back to 1960 and before, the kinds of lifestyles that people lived in America were very similar, regardless of social class background or level of educational attainment or intelligence. But essentially, the point of that book, my takeaway from it was, and this is what I witnessed in my own life, is if you have strong structures in place, then people will live by them. But if you remove those structures, people will make decisions on their own. And if you're a very intelligent, very conscientious person, high impulse control, you live in a safe neighborhood with attentive parents and role models around you, then you can make good decisions even without that social structure in place. But if you don't have those things, if you're not a particularly bright person, you're not academically gifted, you don't have parents around you, you don't have good role models, you have all of these temptations around every corner, and you don't have high self-impulse control, then you're going to fall prey to negative habits. In social psychology, I'm sure that many you and many of your listeners are aware there's this idea in social psychology of strong situations and weak situations. And a strong situation is a situation in which people behave similarly regardless of their individual traits and propensities. And a weak situation is one where the norms are uncertain. People aren't given clear guidance on what to do, and so they are more able to act on their own individual differences. So an example of a strong situation would be a red light. Regardless of how intelligent you are, how much impulse control you have, your conscientiousness or level of education, everyone stops at a red light. A yellow light is a weak situation, and people respond wildly differently to a yellow light depending on how smart they are, how much impulse control they have, their appetite for risk taking,
I live
how
in
cautious
Israel.
they tend to be.
I couldn't agree more.
Mm-hmm. And so my claim basically is that up until decades ago, up until say 1960, 1970, we lived very much in a red light society where we had a strong situation. Here's what you're expected to do. Here's how to live a good life. Here's what's expected of you. And then for the last 60 years or so, we've lived in an increasingly yellow light society where people are uncertain how to respond to what the world around them, what they're supposed to do, what a good life looks like, what are good decisions versus bad decisions.
So, Rob, I couldn't agree more, and I think you encapsulate it brilliantly. But basically, what you were just saying, which leads me to my next question about luxury belief, is the idea that without any strong cultural structure, we need to make up our decision on our own. And smart people will make better decision, and stupid or less smart people will make bad decision. And we can see it all over the place, like in the yellow light scenarios that you just described, which leads the question, so maybe the social structure is just for the poor, is just for the dumb people, and the smart people can get on their own with their mind. So if you could please elaborate on why, in your opinion, the smart people or the elite also need this social structure, because I think it's very important to explain.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things. I mean, one, you could say that there's an individual selfish incentive for them, because even for rich, intelligent people, living by certain set of values is more likely to increase your happiness than not. If you look at the rates of happiness, for example, for married versus non-married people, married people tend to be happier. People who abide by certain values, work really hard, take care of their loved ones, all of those kinds of things. Whether you're rich or poor, the effect on happiness appears to be roughly similar. But then the other thing is, having good values creates a stable and cohesive society. And so, if everyone is on the same page with regard to what a good life looks like, obviously with some exceptions. I don't want to say, everyone has to get married, everyone has to do this, but broadly, if we can all agree, on average, some ways of living are better than others. Obeying the law on average is probably better than breaking the law. But there are a lot of elites who would disagree with that, especially as we saw during the defund the police movement. But we can if we can come to those agreements, then you'll have a more stable society. Eventually, instability and dissent and rebellion, those things can affect elites too. And gradually, you can create situations in which, say, someone like Donald Trump can get elected. Because if people are feeling upset and people are feeling that the system isn't working, if people look around and see that their values aren't reflected back at them, then they're going to elect someone who you may not like because, in many cases, the elites have dropped the ball. They've sort of been asleep at the wheel. They think, well, life's been pretty good for us, and we don't necessarily have to think about everyone else. And then, if you live in a democracy, those people their votes count just as much as yours do. And then gradually, they can elect leaders that you may not agree with. So there are a lot of different things here. You want a cohesive society. You don't want to elect people you have concerns about. You're opposed to different strands of populism. And you yourself want to be happy. Those are all potential reasons why you would want good role models for and good sort of examples and ways to live
Very
by
good.
for people who are believe you sort of lower on the social ladder than you.
Very good. 2 years ago, approximately, I spoke with Barry Schwartz. He's a very famous social
Mm,
psychologist, and he wrote a book about practical wisdom. And the idea of practical wisdom, he wanted to take the idea of Aristotle, being combining intelligence and moral values all together. But for Aristotle, it was very clear and it was very easy to understand that there are some ways of life which are better than other ways of life. And for a liberal like Barry Schwartz, it is very hard to grasp the idea that some ways of life, in order for us to have a cohesive society with the same values, we need to have the idea that not all forms of life are equally morally worth. And some ways of
mm,
life are better. Now, Aristotle was it was very easy for him to do because no, there are four causes, and what is the definition of man? If you don't fulfill your definition as a human being, your life is not worth living. But for a person like
mm.
Barry Schwartz, is completely different. And again, which leads me again to the idea that the American society was constructed or fabricated as a religious society with a very a similar set of values, like a Protestant Calvinistic set of values, which now is different. Now, before we move on to the idea, to the mere idea of luxury belief, with your permission, I would like to read a short paragraph from
Mm.
your book, and if you can explain it, okay? Because it is very
Okay.
important, and I think it mentioned what we just say. When educated Americans discuss what's best for kids, we tend to talk about education as the be all and end all, when it should be seen more as a fortunate benefit of warm, of loving upbringing. Elites are simply too quick to equate education with well being. And again, you said educated people ask how we can get more unprivileged kids into college. That's a laudable goal, but education is a red herring. For many kids, including yourself, having the kind of childhood I had takes a toll in ways that a college degree will never fix. If you can elaborate, because I think this phrase is so important to understand why we putting too much emphasis on education or college degrees where the answer lies in a different place.
Yeah. Well, the point of that passage was, I do stress that, look, it's a laudable goal. Education is something we should strive for. We should get people to maximize their abilities to the best of their potential, make sure that, everyone can fully manifest their strengths. But still, because people who are focused on social mobility, they're looking at kind of legible, measurable outcomes, and a very simple variable that you can measure is educational attainment. How many years of education did you receive? Did you graduate high school? Did you graduate college? Did you get a degree? Those are things that have very simple answers, and you can run statistical models on those, and you can present data to people, and it all looks very professional, and it's great. It's fine. But my point there was we should focus just as much on what happens before the age of 18 as what happens after. And even if our number one goal in life is to get kids through college, um, the best way to do that would still be to promote stable families. So Melissa Carney, in her recent book, The Two-Parent Privilege, she points out that the number one predictor for whether a child goes on to graduate from college is whether the child was raised by two married parents. That is more powerful than socioeconomic status. That's more powerful than whether one of your parents went to college or not. It's more powerful than every other factor. And so even if that's the goal, we should still promote stable families. But what I'm saying is, even if you have a kid who isn't destined to go on to college, isn't destined to, achieve some astounding great story of upward social mobility, the kid is just going to live a very normal life. Is it important for that kid to have two loving parents who prioritize his or her well-being, nurturing, emotional stability, security. Does that kid feel loved or not? I think that's still a good in itself, regardless of how that child goes on to live his or her life. You know, it's funny. A lot of people who are very interested in psychometrics, personality, intelligence, IQ, those kinds of things, they rightly point out that the family environment has very little effect. You know, the shared environment in the sort of behavioral genetics jargon, the shared environment has little effect on a child's outcomes in terms of those measurable variables, education, intelligence, personality, and those things. But what I try to do with my book is to point out that even if that's the case, the subjective firsthand experience of a child still matters, you know, regardless of whatever life they go on to live in the future. We should still ensure that kids feel safe, feel secure, feel taken care of. And, you know, there are reasons otherwise to be concerned about that too.
And intelligence doesn't measure everything. It is very important to mention, state out loud that intelligence is the best psychological predictor ever, but it doesn't measure everything. You know, even Charles Murray, I think, said, you know, the correlation between intelligence and life success is approximately 0.5 to 0.6, which means it is between 25 to 36% of the variance, which means that 75 to 80, 64 are not intelligent, and some of them can be encapsulated as personality and your experiences as a child, and those experiences can vary a lot and can change and can make a huge difference.
That's a good point. Yeah, and the other thing I hope comes through in the book is that, you know, even if you present a bright, talented kid with opportunities, no one can force the child to seize those opportunities. And often when you grow up the way that I did, with unreliable caregivers, you know, instability, turmoil all around you, no positive role models, you know, the child is going to be less likely to take the opportunities presented to them. Yeah.
Why should I? And again, I think, which leads to the idea of luxury belief. So we just had one luxury belief, and that's the holiness. I don't want, you know, yes, I will say holiness, or the importance of the father, mother, loving father and mother as a family is no longer needed. I think this is a luxury belief. Okay. And we have another luxury belief. We have many, and you mentioned a lot of them in the book. For example, we need to defund the police. Okay. Or now, my question is, how do you describe luxury belief, and are they just belief of the elite or the rich, or the elite and the rich are the same thing? And what is the psychological mechanism underneath those beliefs? Do the elite actually believe that although we have all the statistics that you mentioned about being raised in a normal family is the best predictor of higher education, do they still believe, or do they lie to us or to themselves?
It's a good question. Well, I developed this framework, luxury beliefs, which are ideas and opinions that confer status on the affluent while often inflicting costs on the less fortunate members of society. And a core feature of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And, you know, for me, this idea starts with Thorstein Veblen in 1899. He wrote this book, the economist Thorstein Veblen, called The Theory of the Leisure Class. And in this book, written, you know, at the turn of the 20th century, he's writing about how the elites of his day exhibited their status with expensive goods, you know, delicate and restrictive clothing, tuxedos and evening gowns, top hats and pocket watches and monocles. And then you can fast forward to the mid-20th century, and there was a sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu who wrote this book, Distinction, a social critique of the judgment of taste. And in this book, you read about how elites convert their economic capital into cultural capital, into status symbols. And, you know, decades past, elites did this through intricate and arcane knowledge of wine and art and exotic locations. And expressing this kind of knowledge, this is cultural capital, it indicated that you were raised in an upper class family and had access to exclusive educational institutions and social circles. And so the claim today is that luxury beliefs are the new status symbols. It's much harder. You alluded to this earlier that, if you were to walk through the streets of a major city 100 years ago, you could tell immediately who was rich and who was poor just by how they were dressed. Today, that's
watch my pinky. True. Watch my pinky. You see, this is how the rich. This is how the rich drink. You need to upper your pinky.
Pinky out. Yeah. Good etiquette. And so now today, you mentioned this. Now, regardless of social class, people have iPhones. People can go to discount luxury stores and buy material goods, and you can't necessarily tell right away the way that you could when Thorstein Veblen was writing 100 plus years ago who's rich and who's poor by their luxury goods. Which isn't the same, to say that luxury goods still matter. People still buy luxury goods. But my claim is that increasingly luxury beliefs are becoming this new way of exhibiting status. And these beliefs are ideas that often are born in elite universities. They trickle throughout elite media. And then gradually and I cite statistic after statistic in the book indicating that, if you want to talk about attitudes around the family, you want to talk about attitudes around decriminalization of drugs, defunding the police, attitudes around prostitution or sex work or these kind of newfangled attitudes, repeatedly you'll find that elites, people who go to expensive universities and have six-figure and above incomes, they are far more likely to hold attitudes that are at odds with conventional opinion. And these luxury beliefs often have, once they're implemented into culture or into policy, they have long-term detrimental effects for the rest of society. And people will sometimes, sometimes people will challenge me on this and say, well, what's the mechanism there? How is it possible that, elites start espousing something and then that, somehow that magically affects the rest of society? How's that possible? And, there's a lot of research on this, that the attitudes and opinions of elites have outsized effect on our politics, on our media, on sort of opinion formation, what policies get adopted. But a simple way to think about this is, imagine if tomorrow, all of the elites, people who run our elite institutions, people who are graduates of these institutions decided that littering was okay, that, you open the front page or you open the opinion page of the New York Times and, the big headline is stop judging people who litter. You turn on Netflix and the number one trending show, you see, very attractive characters, throwing trash on the floor, flinging their McDonald's out of the moving vehicle, and basically so on and so forth. You hear, prominent people with a lot of influence, political influence, social influence, economic influence saying, littering is totally fine. Stop judging people. Would anyone be surprised if a generation from now, you basically see like the norms have transformed and everyone is littering? You can apply that same logic to so many other things.
Just a second. There are many studies where, let's say that you want to cross a road and there is a traffic, and someone in a suit is crossing the road in a red traffic in a red sign. People will be more likely to follow him, and if he is dressed like a homeless, people will be less likely to follow him. So this is, I think, what you just mentioned is I don't want to say trivial, but is something that we all can relate to.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're basically saying someone who has some cachet, some status, some admiration in society, a leader of some sort, or the person who, writes the glossy magazine articles and the media and the pop culture and all the messaging around us. They have a lot of influence over what we think is a behavior that we should valorize and try to live up to, and ones that we should ignore. And so that is how luxury beliefs work. And my claim is that, interestingly, luxury beliefs do have an outsized effect on sort of lower middle class, working class people. And the reason here is because they often don't have immediate visible models of good behavior in their own lives. And so one way you can think about this is you can imagine a kid who is growing up in an upper middle class neighborhood, goes to a private school, has two married parents. Basically, every adult this kid sees in his life, they work really hard. They went to college. They go to work every day. They obey the law. they're married, or they hope to become married one day, and those are the people around them. But then this upper middle class kid opens up TikTok or opens the internet, watches a show on Netflix or whatever it is, and he sees people doing drugs and people in living in polyamory kind of relationship
And you
structures
see
and
girls,
promoting sex work.
on OnlyFans, which I think
Yeah.
made a huge backlash to feminism, because now it is not
Uh,
men seducing women into prostitute. It is with the women themselves, like
yeah.
20, 25 years old, saying this is the best life I've ever had, and I'm making a six-figure income monthly. Okay, and
Yeah.
now
Yep.
if you want, if everything has the right to his own opinion, I think that the OnlyFans industry has a huge impact, a huge bad, horrific impact on girls who want to be, I think,
Yeah.
not in the sex industry, because the sex industry now is colored with very glamorous colors.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And the whole sort of movement to promote sex work, destigmatize sex work. Well, a lot of those people who agree with it, they would never allow their own daughters to to sell themselves in that way for money. And so yeah, if you're a young girl in an upper middle class neighborhood where everyone expects you to go to college and study and work hard and so on, and then you see, oh, girls are making money on OnlyFans, there's a good you're probably not going to go down that path. But if you're a girl in a poor working class neighborhood, you don't have good role models around you, people didn't work hard, people aren't living by those sort of conventional values, and then you see, oh, OnlyFans is an option, that girl is much more likely to take that path that she may later regret. And boys see that too. Boys see women behaving in that way. And it's one thing if you're a boy in an upper middle class neighborhood and your mom and all of the adult women around you are successful, law-abiding people who, basically present a good image of women for you. But if you're a boy in a neighborhood and you don't have those same strong female role models around you, and then you're seeing, women on Instagram and TikTok and OnlyFans and all these other things, that's going to warp your impression of women, and it will probably have some effect on how you view the opposite sex. And so, all of these things around us, they are powerful forces, and they shape our views of our social world.
Now, you still, unfortunately, I think you didn't answer my question regarding whether they
Hmm.
do actually believe in
Oh, I
those
see.
luxury
Yeah.
beliefs. And again,
Yeah.
I think it was Jordan Peterson who said, you can't be a socialist if you're running a business. Okay, many, the elite, the Ivy League elite universities that shout for socialism or communism never ran a business. Therefore,
Yeah.
they can actually believe in the crap thing of socialism or communism. But my question is
Yeah.
regarding,
Yeah.
the unnecessity of a conventional family, father and mother. We
Mhm.
do have the statistics. So
Yeah.
how come we have the statistic and the statistics are so clear, and people from the elite still hold those luxury beliefs with no data support whatsoever?
Yeah. Well, so it's a good question. So basically, are they sincere in their
Oh,
beliefs? Is there an element of conscious duplicity? I think there are kind of three general categories of people who express luxury beliefs. This is very rough, but I would say probably 20% of people who express luxury beliefs are consciously duplicitous, that they actually know on some level that these aren't actually good ways to live, but they basically harbor negative attitudes or hostile attitudes towards the United States, towards America, towards the Western world at large, basically towards capitalism, all of these things. And they believe that by promoting, say, defund the police or abandon the idea of the family, or basically take sword and fire to all of these conventional bourgeois norms and values, that this will kind of accelerate the decline of the West and bring about potentially, we'll enter this period of chaos and anarchy, and then out of the ashes we'll build the socialist utopia. I think 10 to 20% of people who espouse luxury beliefs are consciously manipulative and malicious in that way. And then I would say, some other percentage of people, maybe 50% plus, are kind of naive, they have essentially convinced themselves they believe it, but without actually giving it much thought. They hear, oh, we shouldn't stigmatize people who make certain choices about how they live their lives, about the family. Whether if they want to do drugs, that's fine. Who am I to judge? Maybe we should rethink the police. It all sounds, kind of compassionate. It sounds interesting. It sounds sophisticated. It sets you apart from the masses. Oh, the masses think police and law enforcement is good. Most people think that drugs are harmful. Well, a good way to stand out from them is to believe the opposite. And just by coincidence, it also makes you sound compassionate and empathic and understanding. So I think those people are true believers, but not in the sense that they've rigorously thought through. They just sort of take that surface level, oh, well, it sounds good, and it's in the pages of prestigious media outlets and other people who are getting a lot of attention and respect for saying it. They believe it, so I guess I'll just passively go along. And then I think there's probably another 30% of people who they're duplicitous, but in a different way, where they mouth the slogans of the luxury beliefs, but they don't believe them, but they go along with it because they're cowards. They'll post, the hashtag, they'll post the black square on Instagram, they'll mouth the right things about attitudes around laws and family and drugs and crime and prostitution and everything else. They harbor some doubts inside, but they falsify their preferences because they want to get along. They don't want to damage their prospects of getting into the right college or the right internship or the right job.
As belonging to the third group?
Interesting. I think she's probably more the second group. I don't know her, and I've only ever seen that one sort of viral clip of her crying. But someone like, I think most people who do that, they are in that second group of kind of naive, foolish. They've become sort of disconnected from reality, and so they just say things even if they haven't really thought through their own opinions very hard.
And as an Israeli after October 7, I must ask you, the luxury belief of promoting Hamas in elite university, in Colombian University and Penn University, and all the merchant and all the screaming from the river to the sea, and you don't know which river and what sea, etc. It seems that this is a luxury belief. You're anti-colonialism, you're taking the oppressed side, but you are not near any Muslim, and the laws of Sharia don't apply on you. So you are sheltered, as you said before, from the bad consequences of your beliefs. And my question is, according to your opinion, the idea of all the anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas movements that we have seen in October 8th and 9th and later on, would you consider this also as a luxury belief in US campuses?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, so many of these luxury beliefs, including this pro-Hamas, these demonstrations, these are luxury beliefs. I recorded a video essay for the New York Times last July in response to these encampments at places like Columbia and Yale and Penn. And, these students arrive en masse. A lot of them are wealthy students. There was this viral story at Columbia of this guy who was an heir to a multi-million-dollar fortune. He wasn't even a student at Columbia. He might have been an alum, but he was 40 years old, the son of an ultra-wealthy, I think, real estate developer or something along those lines. He was, basically a rich kid, even though he was 40. He and his fellow agitators took over a building at Columbia, and then they trapped a janitor inside. And so this guy, these demonstrators, these were all wealthy white kids, and they trapped this janitor at Columbia in the building. And I believe he was either black or Puerto Rican. He was a blue collar worker. He was there cleaning up the building after hours. He didn't know that these people had stormed the building and had locked it down, and they refused to allow him to leave and essentially took him hostage. And he tried to leave, and there are clips of this and video of this of him trying to escape and them physically blocking him. And so in their minds, they were doing this wonderful, noble thing, but instead they ended up harassing the staff on campus.
Do you think that in their mind
the broader belief is
and again, Rob, it's very important. Do you think in their mind they did like this heroic thing?
Yeah.
In
their mind, they've convinced themselves. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, look, a lot of these people, especially the kind of anarchist, sort of extreme left, they follow the playbook of, the sort of Leninist agitator groups where basically the short version is that the means justify, or the ends justify the means. That if somehow we can get Colombia to divest or put out a statement of some kind, as if, holding an encampment at Colombia is actually going to move the needle in terms of what's happening in the Middle East. But in their mind, somehow they think, oh, if we can get Colombia to submit to us in some way, and this ultimately helps us to achieve our goals, then whatever we do in the meantime is perfectly fine. Principles are bourgeois crutches, and that ultimately, if we have to crack a few eggs to make an omelet, that's fine.
I think just like Nietzsche said, there is a resentment against the Western culture and everything that you do
Yes.
in order to destroy the Western culture and create a new utopian world that was never existed just in your head is kosher, is legal, and the ends justify the means. I think what you just said, and this is a pure left slogan. Now, in a recent interview, you said, and you mentioned celebrities, and this is why I mentioned Selena Gomez, that are using luxury belief as a way to enhance their perceived moral character. It is you are on the good side, and you don't need to pay anything more than a post on social media. And you have identified a psychological phenomenon you call the virtuous victim effect, where victims are automatically seen as more virtuous regardless of their actual behavior. BLM, I think, is a very, very good example. And my question is, do you think there is a tipping point where the public will reject celebrities using victimhood as a virtue signal? And if so, what might trigger such a shift? And we have seen, like, the beginning of the shift with the Trump administration and with other things. But when would you say that the media or like will reject celebrities doing this?
Well, we've already started to see it. I mean, I don't know if you watched the Oscars recently, but it was remarkably devoid of overt politics, and I think a lot of celebrities have come to understand that normal people don't want to be preached to or moralized to by ultra wealthy, ultra famous celebrities about how they should vote or who they should support. And yeah, the virtuous victim effect, it's interesting because initially there was in 2020 this widespread support for BLM, and part of it was, I think, this group had been historically marginalized and mistreated, and who wouldn't want to support a group like that? But then, by 2022, 2023, there's a limit to people's patience and tolerance, even for virtuous victims. And if, the people who claim to be part of this movement, whether they were or not, are setting cars on fire, committing crimes, violence, looting, vandalism, and then later supporting the horrific event on October 7th. A lot of social media posts affiliated with BLM were saying that this is they supported this act, and by that point, I think people had just about enough. That if you're a virtuous victim and you are sort of morally gray and you do things that are kind of morally ambiguous, I think people are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. But if you are a virtuous victim and you actually do like commit horrific transgressions, or you support those who do, then most people will turn against you and will not sort of confer special status on you anymore.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have like last question, and again, it's from your recent interview, and you said even if we were fully committed today to reforming the institutions, you mean the universities, it would it would be a decades-long effort. There is space for new institutions. And my question is, because I think the universities are rotten, my question is, what, in your opinion, what specific steps would a new independent university need to take to avoid falling into the trap of becoming another ideological institution? And again, what do we need to do in order to build something new?
Well, I think one would be to actually enforce the rules that are on the books. So one of the things that surprised me in the wake of October 7th is that the universities actually started to do this. And I think in part because of pressure from donors, because the general public had become fed up with the lunacy on elite campuses, where if students broke into a building or vandalized a building, they actually called the police and had these students arrested because they broke the law. You know, in any other context in the world, if you vandalize and destroy a building, you're going to get arrested. But for years, we elite college students have somehow become immune to being held to the same standard. But in the last couple of years, we've seen a little bit of a shift, only the last year and a half or so. And I think, yeah, any new institution would say, you know, we're actually going to enforce the rules that you have to, you know, be upheld, held to the same standard. You break the law, you know, you could potentially get arrested. If you violate codes of conduct for character, you can actually be expelled. You can be suspended. I think a lot of students have become very brazen over the last 10 years or so because they've witnessed other students get away with things and they thought, oh, well, they can do it. Why can't I? And you sort of seen it spiral out of control ever since. So much so that they, you know, flagrantly break the law, set up encampments, and then call themselves victims. You know, there was that famous video at Columbia of those student encampments, and they were saying, "Oh, why isn't the university providing us with food and water? You know, this is like a public health crisis." You know, and it's like, "Oh, you're students at an Ivy League university claiming that because the university isn't helping you to violate their own rules, that they're the ones who are in the wrong here." So, you know, I think that would be one. And then also a very firm commitment to free speech, the First Amendment, academic freedom, that no professor will ever be pressured to resign or ever be fired for expressing an opinion. And for supporting, you know, academic freedom and the pursuit of truth. And also, you know, like it's interesting. Like, I think that there is probably a limit as far as like who is beyond the pale as far as who a student group could invite as a guest speaker. So, you know, for example, you know, you and I have been talking about Charles Murray. I think he's a perfectly respectable and brilliant social scientist. A lot of students would disagree. He's been shouted down. He's been disinvited.
He is persona non grata for all the universities in the US, or almost all the university in the US, unfortunately.
Yeah. Despite the fact that, in my opinion, he is one of the few living social scientists whose entire body of work is worth reading. And so for me, he is like very clearly within the Overton window. Now you could say, oh, you know, if there was like an actual neo-Nazi or some, you know, a pedophilia apologist or some horrible character like that, should they be allowed on campus? Maybe, but like that's a discussion that we can actually have. I think that any new institution or existing institution needs to be more clear about where that line is instead of keeping it obscure.
A bodyguard that goes with him to every university in the US, and Ben Shapiro pays this bodyguard because it is needed. Okay, and again, Ben Shapiro speaks for the conservative and for the conservatism and for the U.S. traditional values. And many people, like Antifa, breaks in and tried to prevent him from speaking his thought.
Yeah, and well, what's interesting there about those kinds of tactics is it is true that one reason why they are attempting to shut down someone like Ben Shapiro from speaking is because they just don't like Ben Shapiro. But another objective of these groups is to send a signal to observers that Ben Shapiro is unacceptable, the opinions he expresses is unacceptable, and therefore you can't say those things either. And so by making an example of Ben Shapiro, so if I'm a student at one of these campuses and I see these Antifa or these leftist agitator groups successfully disinvite Ben Shapiro and stigmatize him and say his opinions are beyond the pale, even if I agree with Ben Shapiro, now I'm going to be far less likely to express those opinions on campus. And so that's another objective of theirs, is to basically police what opinions we should be allowed to say and which ones we aren't. And, you know, they're often very successful at this, that, you know, it's not so much, you know, eliminating speakers we disagree with, although that is one point. But the other point is we also want to eliminate the possibility of anyone publicly agreeing with them or expressing similar opinions every day in everyday life on this campus, whether in the classroom, in the courtyard, in the dorm rooms. Like, we just want to eliminate this opinion completely.
It's a very good point. And I think that there is one sentence that can summarize our entire conversation. And it was mentioned by Oscar Wilde. There are some ideas so absurd that only an intellectual could believe them. And I think it encapsulates everything. First of all, I want to thank you very much for your time and your wisdom, and some of your ideas are just mind blowing. And I always ask my guests one final question. We mentioned a lot of books, including Coming Apart. Besides Coming Apart, which is a great book, there a book that you would recommend our viewers who have reached up until now and they want more of this theory? Again, we have your book, which is a great book, Troubled, and besides Coming Apart and your book, can you recommend another book?
There's a great book that came out about 20, almost 25 years ago now. It's called Life at the Bottom by the author Theodore Dalrymple. And the author, he was a prison doctor and he's a physician who worked in an inner city hospital. And the book is a collection of chapters of his observations working with prison inmates and low income people at this hospital. And essentially, he never uses the phrase luxury beliefs, but a lot of that idea was inspired by his work as well, of people making self-defeating mistakes, living in squalor, no social structure around them, no good role models. And so the book is called Life at the Bottom. He points out, there's a great line early in that book where he says, he's traveled around the world working as a doctor in a lot of poor developing countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. But he says that he's never been to a place that had quite as much emotional and spiritual poverty as the Western underclass. That despite the fact that the Western underclass isn't as poor as a lot of these villages and communities elsewhere in the world, there's a kind of a malaise and an absence of agency and some kind of a crisis that's hard to pinpoint, but he does an admirable job of exploring it throughout that book, Life at the Bottom.
Thank you so much. So we have Coming Apart, Troubled, and living from the bottom, in the bottom, or
Life at the Bottom. Life at the Bottom.
Life at the bottom. So,
Yep.
Dr. Rob Kim Henderson, thank you so much for your time. It was very important, I think. Okay, let's summarize. Your work is very important. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Dr. Yozevich. Thank you.